A ceasefire was supposed to mean the shooting had stopped. Nobody told that to the missiles, the drones, and the small boats that came racing toward 3 American warships in the Strait of Hormuz. This was not a rumor. This was not a leak from an anonymous source. This was Iran, in the middle of an active truce, opening fire on the United States Navy. And what happened in the minutes after is the part almost nobody outside the Pentagon has actually had explained to them. Before we get into it, if you want the real sequence of events, not the 15-second clip version everyone else is running, take 2 seconds and hit subscribe. This channel exists to lay out exactly what happened, in order, with nothing skipped. Let's get into it. To understand why an American destroyer ended up dodging missiles in a supposed peacetime, you have to go back a few months to the operation that changed everything in the region. In late February, the United States and Israel launched a joint military campaign against Iran. A sweeping, coordinated strike aimed at Iran's military leadership, its missile production sites, and what remained of its nuclear infrastructure. It was not a symbolic strike. It reached deep into Iranian territory, hitting facilities that had spent years being treated as untouchable. Iran answered the only way it could, by firing back. Waves of missiles and drones went out toward Israel and toward American positions across the region. Gulf states like the UAE and Kuwait suddenly found themselves running live air defense operations, shooting down Iranian fire that was never meant for them in the first place. And then Iran played the one card that could hurt the entire planet at once. It moved to shut down the Strait of Hormuz. If that name doesn't mean much to you, here's why it should. Roughly a fifth of the world's oil and a massive share of its natural gas moves through this single stretch of water every day. At its narrowest point, the strait is barely wide enough for 2 ships to pass safely. Every tanker heading out of the Persian Gulf has no choice but to squeeze through this same corridor, close enough to the Iranian coastline that shore-based missiles and small patrol boats can reach them without ever leaving home waters. When Iran's Revolutionary Guard started broadcasting warnings that safe passage was no longer guaranteed, the world listened. Shipping companies didn't wait to find out who was right. Some turned their ships around. Others sat anchored in port, unwilling to risk a $100 million vessel on a standoff with no clear end date. By mid-April, both sides agreed to a ceasefire. On paper, the shooting was supposed to be over. In reality, that's where the story got more complicated, because a ceasefire between governments doesn't automatically reopen a blockaded strait, and it doesn't magically convince thousands of stranded sailors it's safe to move again. So the United States launched a new mission, built specifically to force the strait back open and physically escort commercial shipping through it under Navy protection. That decision is exactly what put American destroyers back into some of the most dangerous water on Earth, not during open war, supposedly during peace. Here's something you need to understand about how Iran actually fights, because what happened next wasn't panic. It was a plan Iran had rehearsed for years. Iran has never tried to build a navy that can go ship for ship with the United States. It knows it can't win that fight. Instead, it built an entire doctrine around something else, overwhelming a stronger enemy through sheer numbers and simultaneous chaos. Dozens of small, cheap, fast attack boats, shore-launched cruise missiles, drones, all of it timed to hit at once, forcing a defending ship to burn through its limited stock of interceptors trying to stop everything in the same 30 seconds. Iran had been training for exactly this scenario for years. And in early May, that training got its first live test. Cruise missiles, drones, and small boats aimed at commercial ships and American naval vessels moving through the strait. American helicopters sank several of the small attack boats within hours. Iranian state media claimed a missile had actually struck a U.S. destroyer. The American military said flatly, "No vessel was hit." Keep that gap in mind, because it's going to matter again before this video is over. What Iranian state television tells its own people and what the U.S. military confirms on the record are almost never the same story. 3 days later, that first clash turned out to be nothing more than a rehearsal for something much bigger. If this is giving you the real picture so far, drop a like before you keep going. It's the fastest way to tell YouTube this is worth putting in front of more people who are tired of the 15-second version. Let's keep moving, because this is where it gets serious. 3 Arleigh Burke-class guided missile destroyers were moving together through the Strait of Hormuz, escorting commercial traffic under the new protection mission, weeks after both nations had officially agreed the shooting was supposed to be over. According to U.S. Central Command's own statement, Iran launched missiles, drones, and small boats at all 3 destroyers simultaneously. Sit with that for a second. This wasn't one missile from one launcher on the coast. This was a coordinated multi-domain assault, missiles in the air, drones overhead, small boats on the water, all converging on 3 separate American warships at nearly the same moment. Somebody on the Iranian side had to track those ships as they moved through the strait, line up missile batteries, drone units, and boat squadrons ahead of time the launch sequence so everything arrived close enough together to overwhelm the defenses instead of getting picked off one at a time. That takes planning. That takes command and control. That does not happen by accident, and every part of it failed. Central Command's statement was direct. American forces intercepted the unprovoked attack and responded with self-defense strikes. 0 U.S. vessels hit, not one. 3 ships facing missiles, drones, and boats thrown at them all at once, and nothing got through. Here's the part most coverage skips entirely, and it's worth slowing down for because the attack failed doesn't explain anything on its own. Ships like these are built around something called the Aegis combat system. Think of it as the ship's brain and eyes working together in real time. A radar array constantly scans the surrounding sky and sea, tracking dozens of potential threats at once and feeding that information into a system that decides, in a fraction of a second, which threats are most dangerous and which weapon should respond first. That defense works in layers, like a set of nets stacked one behind another. The outer layer uses long-range interceptor missiles, designed to take out an incoming threat while it's still far away. If something slips past that, the ship has close-in weapon systems. Rapid-fire, radar-guided cannons built to shred an incoming missile or drone in its final seconds before impact. Running alongside all of that, electronic warfare systems try to jam the guidance on incoming missiles and drones, so they simply lose track of the ship and fly off course. And against small attack boats specifically, the ship's own deck guns and onboard helicopters give the crew a completely separate way to fight back at close range. Now multiply that by 3 ships moving together, each one covering blind spots the others might have. That overlapping web of radar and weapons is exactly why a coordinated attack across 3 different threat types still ended with nothing getting through. Within roughly 90 minutes, the American response reached far beyond the immediate coastline the attack had launched from, hitting missile and drone launch sites, command centers, and intelligence infrastructure stretching from southern Iran inward. This wasn't a narrow strike against the exact spot the missiles came from. It was aimed at the network that made an attack like this possible in the first place. I want to ask you something here, and I'm genuinely curious. Does a defense like this prove American naval technology has permanently solved the swarm attack problem? Or does one successful defense not tell you what happens the day Iran throws twice as much at once? Drop your honest answer in the comments. I read everyone, and I want to see where this community actually lands. This clash wasn't a single spike sitting alone in the middle of an otherwise quiet ceasefire. It was the peak of a much longer, messier pattern. In the days around it, a European-flagged commercial vessel passing through the strait came under fire, with crew members injured. On a separate day, a U.S. Navy fighter disabled an Iranian tanker allegedly violating the blockade, striking its smokestack rather than its hull, a deliberate choice meant to disable the ship without punching a hole below the waterline and risking an environmental disaster. Small detail, but it tells you something about how much restraint was actually built into even the more aggressive parts of this campaign. Roughly 3 weeks later, Central Command again announced self-defense strikes, this time hitting Iranian boats caught laying naval mines and a surface-to-air missile site that had reportedly been targeting American aircraft. Iranian state media claimed once again that an American drone had been shot down. The U.S. side, once again, said nothing to confirm it. Same pattern every single time. 2 governments telling 2 completely different stories about the same night. And all of this was unfolding while diplomats on both sides were still sitting across the table, trying to build a broader peace deal. One that would extend the ceasefire in exchange for a long-term commitment from Iran to end its nuclear program. In other words, missiles were being launched and tankers were being disabled at the exact same time American and Iranian officials were negotiating an extension of the very ceasefire both sides kept accusing each other of breaking. That's not really a contradiction. It's closer to how modern ceasefires actually function. Negotiations and low-level combat frequently run in parallel, each side using continued military pressure to strengthen its position at the table without wanting to be the one seen collapsing the whole deal. Before we go further, one more small thing. If this video is actually helping you understand a story most channels rush through in 30 seconds, share it with one person who's been following the headlines without ever seeing how the pieces connect. That single share genuinely does more for a channel like this than almost anything else. It's easy to talk about this in terms of destroyers and interceptors and miss what it actually looked like on the water. For weeks, the strait was effectively strangled, close to 2,000 commercial ships either stuck in place or rerouting entirely. Oil markets reacted in real time, spiking every time headlines broke and easing every time ceasefire talk resurfaced. Zoom out beyond just this one stretch of water and the scale gets harder to ignore. The UAE alone confirmed hundreds of ballistic missile and drone launches fired from Iran and Iranian-backed positions across the wider conflict. The US put its own tally at close to 100 cruise missiles, and nearly 300 drones aimed at just one American base. Numbers like that tell you this wasn't an isolated flare-up. It was one visible piece of a much larger, sustained pattern of pressure running across the entire region, with regional allies running their own missile defense operations in parallel and quietly sharing intercept data directly with the American military. Seen that way, the single naval engagement isn't a fight between two countries. It's one visible moment inside a much larger coalition effort. Multiple nations working together under sustained pressure to intercept an overlapping wave of fire aimed at more than one country at the same time. That coalition dimension is the part that tends to disappear once a story narrows down to just American ship survives Iranian attack. There's a genuine ongoing debate among people who study this closely, and it's worth laying out both sides honestly instead of picking one and moving on. One side argues this is strong evidence that American naval defense has genuinely caught up to Iran's swarm doctrine, that a system built specifically to overwhelm through numbers just failed completely against a properly layered defense, and that proves the doctrine itself can be beaten. The other side pushes back hard on that. A single successful defense against one wave of fire doesn't tell you what happens against an even larger wave. More drones, more boats, launched from more directions, spread across a smaller number of ships than 3 destroyers moving together. Defeating one coordinated attack is not the same as defeating every attack that might come after it. There's also a resource argument worth taking seriously. Every interceptor missile a destroyer fires to knock down one drone is a missile it can't fire again until it restocks, and a ship can only carry so many before it has to sail back to port. If Iran's actual long-term goal isn't necessarily winning any single engagement outright, but simply forcing the US to burn through interceptors faster than it can replace them, then whether the math favors Iran over time becomes a resource and logistics question, one that almost certainly gets calculated behind closed doors on both sides every single time one of these engagements happens. No matter where you personally land on that debate, the pattern throughout this stretch is not in dispute. Iran attacks commercial or military shipping. The United States retaliates against the launch sites and command infrastructure behind it. Some version of that cycle, repeated multiple times in a matter of weeks. All of it happening underneath a ceasefire that was supposed to have already ended major hostilities. That gap between the official diplomatic status of ceasefire in place and the day-to-day reality of ships firing on each other in the strait is really the center of this entire story. If you want to actually be here for whatever the next chapter of this looks like instead of catching it secondhand from a clip with no context, subscribe and turn on notifications now. This is exactly the kind of story that keeps developing in stages. Most channels won't bother connecting for you, so here's where this leaves us. Iran, in the middle of an active ceasefire, launched a coordinated missile, drone, and small boat attack on 3 American guided missile destroyers, following a doctrine it had spent decades building around exactly this kind of overwhelming, simultaneous assault. It failed completely. Every missile, every drone, every boat stopped by a layered defense running across 3 ships working together. Not a single American sailor was hurt. Not a single vessel was struck. Within about 90 minutes, the American response reached far beyond the coastline the attack came from, hitting the command centers and infrastructure that made a synchronized assault like that possible in the first place. And this didn't happen once. It happened again, in different forms, across the following weeks. A steady rhythm of Iranian pressure and immediate American response, running in parallel with quiet diplomatic efforts to lock in the very ceasefire both sides kept insisting the other one had already broken. Whatever comes out of those negotiations next, the water underneath the Strait of Hormuz has already shown more than once exactly how fast a ceasefire signed in a conference room can turn into live combat in the middle of a single transit, and exactly how decisively American naval forces have answered every time that line got tested. 3 ships went in. 3 ships came out untouched. And underneath that one clean statistic sits a much bigger question neither side has fully answered yet. What happens the day the numbers don't come out this way? If this gives you the real sequence behind a story most coverage only shows you in fragments, you know what to do. Like it, share it, and subscribe so you're here for whatever happens next in the Strait of Hormuz.